Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us today for this conversation. And I am Stuart Schrader. I'm the Associate Director of the Program in Racism, Immigration, and Citizenship here at Johns Hopkins University. And we're really grateful for everybody joining us today for what promises to be an enlightening conversation about a wonderful new book. I want to thank the co-sponsor of this event, the 21st Century Cities Initiative, and especially Mac McComas, who is the Senior Program Manager at 21st Century Cities and my collaborator. We're really grateful for 21st Century Cities' interest in supporting research and programming on questions of urban inequality in Baltimore and beyond. Let me tell you a little bit about the Program in Racism, Immigration, and Citizenship. This is an interdisciplinary collective here at Johns Hopkins University. We bring together students and faculty from across the university to promote an alternative and public vision of scholarship, pedagogy, and learning, primarily on our core themes of, as you guessed it, racism, immigration, and citizenship. And this event extends our current theme that is a biannual theme for this year and the next school year, which we are calling Freedom Education. And if you'll indulge me, I just want to read a sentence or two from our description of what freedom education entails, what it's all about. So to advance political education and progressive research agendas, we aim to unmake the educational legacies of colonialism, to improve the public accessibility of incarcerated intellectual work, to support career planning in fields related to preserving subaltern knowledge, and to ending our social dependence on prisons and state violence, period. This is what we mean by freedom education, and it represents RIC's pointed investment in reversing trends that devalue Black, Brown, Indigenous, and incarcerated communities. Now, I should say that this vision of freedom education would be impossible without the leadership of RIC Director Dr. Nathan Connolly, who is also the Director of Storytime with Dr. Connolly. And in his little amount of spare time, he is decolonizing the Herbert Baxter Adams Associate Professorship in the Department of History here at Johns Hopkins University. This conversation today also represents the inauguration of a project for RIC that we're calling Democracy Dialogues, which is fundamentally an effort to bring scholarly knowledge out from the seminar room and into a more public space, to produce somewhat less ephemeral and more permanent records of the types of conversations that RIC is known for. And we are currently in the process of selecting some JHU graduate students who will help us continue this project in the near future of Democracy Dialogue. So watch out for more announcements about this soon. So our first Democracy Dialogue here is with our esteemed guest, Dr. Rebecca Marchiel, who is Assistant Professor of History at the University of Mississippi. And I'm so glad to have Rebecca here today for this very important conversation. We first got to know each other when we were both fellows at the Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History at Harvard University, and that's where I first read some of the portions of the new book that is the focus today. And that book is titled After Redlining, the Urban Reinvestment Movement in the Era of Financial Deregulation. And it was just published in September by the University of Chicago Press in their Historical Studies in Urban America series. And Rebecca Marchiel received her PhD in history from Northwestern University in 2014. And we're so delighted to have her here today for this conversation. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Connolly, and if the audience members have any questions that they would like to ask our speakers, please use the Q&A function and we will collect those questions and address them in our conversation. So with that, let me turn it over to the two of you, and thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Rebecca, welcome virtually to Johns Hopkins University. I really appreciate you taking the time to join us. And obviously, with so much that we all have to navigate and negotiate now with our domestic life, it's all the more valuable and precious to have you taking the time out to really, get us a deep dive into your thinking and your work, and to give us a chance to talk to you firsthand about this really extraordinary contribution you've made to the literature. So again, thank you. I also want to thank everyone who is tapping into their very precious Zoom restores and reserves to be able to sustain this kind of energy for online learning and conversation. It is not something to overlook, that it takes a great deal to be able to tune in to these kinds of online events and keep the intellectual life of the university going alive and well, even in these times. So thank you all for joining us as well. So Rebecca, you and I have the benefit of coming to this as colleagues in the grand experiment that is American urban history. We both are urban historians. And among your many accomplishments by way of Harvard and doctorate at Northwestern, and landing an extraordinarily precious professorship at a time when there's been a protracted contraction in the academic job market, a lot of people might be surprised to learn that you and I actually overlapped at the University of Michigan many years ago in the early 2000s, when I was a graduate student and you were an undergraduate taking classes with a still very earnest and intrepid professor there named Matt Lassiter, who's gone on to work with a number of urbanists who have really shaped the field in incredible ways. But I'm just really curious to, one, get a sense of your kind of early exposure to urban history as a field. Give us a sense of your hometown, and maybe even the extent to which you learn how to read the environment, the built environment, as a kind of early student of urban studies and urban history.
Mm-hmm. Well, first, thank you, Nathan, so much for taking the time to talk with me, and to Stuart for the invitation, and Mac for all his help with the logistics and the support too. So yes, we did overlap at Michigan, but I had a very good TA in that class with Matt Lasser, but it was unfortunately not Nathan Connolly. I just missed it. But so I feel like my early interest in studying cities does really come from my own biography and my own background. So my parents grew up in Detroit, but like other white people in the 1970s, they became white flighters, right? So they moved to Macomb County, where Stan Greenberg wrote his book about Reagan Democrats. And I feel like my first interest was not actually about the built environment, and was more about memory, right? Memory of the city. That my parents just had a lot of nostalgia for the neighborhood where they grew up, that they, spoke really fondly of the old neighborhood and, friends and businesses and that sort of thing. But they also didn't really think about the ways in which they participated in the neighborhood changing by deciding to leave it. And so I always sort of had questions about the gap between their stories about Detroit and then our visits to Detroit, right? They would always, talk about where things used to be, but we're not very interested in sort of what was there now. I hope my parents aren't watching this. Or they're watching this. And so, I think it was that sort of discrepancy between their own memory and the sort of history of what happened. And then this project too, I feel like also, we'll get more into the project itself, but I think it also came out of my questions about what other kinds of responses to to the potential of living in integrated cities were out there in the 1970s, right? Paths that my parents didn't necessarily take. So, so that's actually where I think my sort of interest in urban history starts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an extraordinary way in to thinking about how our urban history sensibilities are oftentimes tethered to particular decades that can mean different things depending on we're coming of age. And I definitely want to come back to this question of the 70s and what the 70s kind of imprint can do, both in generational terms, in terms of you hearing about the experience of urban life in the 70s, but also as scholars begin to look for new terrain to think about their work in innovative ways, certain decades kind of rise to the fore as being especially rich places to begin asking questions. Now, I want to also just give a tip of the hat to our colleagues in the 21st Century Cities Initiative, in part because the folks at 21CC have been, part of a movement really around a number of different universities to think about real world applications of the kind of work that urban historians are doing, thinking about, progressive uses of data, combining GIS with more traditional kind of archival approaches. And in some ways, your work is coming into a moment where the urban history field is finding brand new audiences in policy circles and new kinds of appreciation, frankly, in the public arena. You think about even going back to something as blockbuster as Ta-Nehisi Coates' piece on the case for reparations, how much someone like Beryl Satter was instrumental in creating the argument for the 20th century. And I'm thinking about even your own work as part of a really extraordinary new library of works that are thinking about life after redlining. And for those folks who are looking for a version of the cover to get a sense of it, here it is. And I wanted to just give a plug for a couple of other works that I found really in keeping with the novelty of the moment, which is Know Your Price by Andre Perry, a really extraordinary work about Black home equity and the loss of it, as well as Brian Goldstein's Roots of the Urban Renaissance. So many of these works are taking into consideration now what happens after the fair housing laws are passed and after the HUD office begins to start enforcing different kinds of anti-racism and so forth. One last mention, of course, to Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor's book, Race for Profit, which is getting all kinds of appropriate attention as well. But I want to bear down on your decision to arrive at After Redlining as a title and as a topic. And what did you see as being the most useful and transformative about taking what we might think we know about the redlining period and giving us a chance to really bear down and look at what happens after some of the most important legislation of the 1960s is passed?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, so thinking about the title of the book as After Redlining, right, I really think about that as a kind of reference to what happens after the institutions responsible for redlining finally admit that redlining is real, right? So thinking about savings and loans and financial institutions that for a long time their narrative had been, we're not discriminating, right? We're not creating these conditions. We are responding to consumer demand, right? We're responding to what home buyers want. And so there's a moment, right, over the course of the 1970s where you do have some of these institutions start to admit that that had been part of their common sense, part of the way that they'd made their business decisions, and that they were ready to talk about different ways of doing business. So, it's a reference to those kind of institutions, the federal government too, right, recognizing that this had been standard practice, and then endorsing anti-redlining policies like the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, right, which is a 1975 piece of legislation that requires that depository institutions, so institutions that hold savings accounts, they have to disclose the geographic location of their mortgage lending, right, to make it possible for outsiders to see patterns of discrimination. And then also the Community Reinvestment Act of 1977, right, legislation that says that depository institutions have some obligation to lend or to try to lend in low and moderate income neighborhoods outside their offices, right? So after redlining is looking at when those institutions admit that redlining was real. But really, right, what really happens after redlining, I think a lot of us here know is more redlining, right? That we know that redlining does not end, right? That there was a report from, I think it was 2017 or 2018 by the Center for Investigative Reporting that still showed that there were a disproportionate number of loan denials for people of color, even if you sort of accounted for things like income and for loan amount, right? So those patterns are still, those kinds of behaviors are still ongoing, right? In part because they're so tricky to sort of pin down, right? To prove without a shadow of a doubt that the reason a financial institution denied someone a loan was solely for the basis of their race, right, or the racial demographics of the neighborhood, that's really difficult to prove, right? And there are other factors that they can point to, right? Like, oh, it was interest rates, or oh, it was, the loan amount or the loan to income ratio. There are other things that you can always sort of point to, which makes it really hard to identify particular instances of racial discrimination in lending. But so one of the things that I thought one of the things I have been sort of thinking about are the different ways too that we know discrimination still happens in the realm of housing that is not necessarily attached to redlining, right? Redlining isn't the only form of discrimination that happens. So if we think about redlining simply as a bank's decision to refuse a loan in a particular neighborhood because of the demographics of the neighborhood or because of the age of the housing stock, right? There's a lot more that happens than just a loan denial. And so again, I was thinking about, you just talked about Kianga Taylor's book, but she shows that there are instances, after this moment, after the 68 moment when redlining is supposed to be illegal, when we don't see loan denials, right, as the form of discrimination. Instead, we see these overeager sort of real estate hucksters going after low-income people, especially Black women, recognizing that there's an opportunity to extract wealth, right, from their households and from their neighborhoods by making loans, right? And that she talks about that sort of idea of predatory inclusion there, right? So again, this isn't redlining, but it's another sort of form of housing-based inequality that we can see in this period, again, as you were saying, after the 68 moment, when you're not supposed to be able to discriminate like that anymore.
Right. And this history is, again, for many people, completely new information. I mean, folks who might be in the kind of housing policy, circle and who are interested in the more wonky aspects of, what happens under George Romney and under, the subsequent, housing and urban development secretaries, might have some sense of this. But you're exactly right to say that there's almost a way in which, we have this big gray area between, what we imagine to be this redlining period and what we're kind of in now, which is supposedly not that, which clearly you're taking some issue with. And I want to come back actually later in our conversation to maybe, what it means to have the redlining conversation now be such a commonplace one and what maybe some of the benefits and costs of that are. But just pivoting to what you were suggesting on the question of the 1970s period, and you're talking about legislation, Home Mortgage Disclosure Act of 75, you have Community Reinvestment Act of 77, the way in which you described the challenges of being able to litigate racism, being, a feature in part of a decision in 1976, Washington v. Davis, right, where discriminatory intent becomes a very narrow frame in which people are trying to, think through these dilemmas. And as somebody who is working and learning, frankly, all the time about, his new hometown of Baltimore, one of the things that was really stunning to me was to see, in the early, 2000 aughts around Wells Fargo and what was happening there with reverse redlining, to your point, Rebecca, about this going on and continuing, that you had Wells Fargo being able to target Black communities through Black churches and, basically setting them up to be feasted on through these very dangerous forms of credit, adjustable rate mortgages and the like. And in that moment, the argument that was being made to Black people was partly, about increasing their financial literacy, right? This question of, let's not think so much about, righting the wrongs of the past. Let's not worry so much about the predatory history of the financial sector. Let's up your financial literacy. And so the 70s also seems, at least, as a place where this question of financial literacy is now rising in ways that are extraordinarily complicated. And so I would love if you could, on the one hand, give us a sense of what did it mean to activists at first in your study in Chicago, and then as the movement begins to build nationally, what did it mean for people to develop a sense of the financial sector? And is it possible to think about, even when people are encouraging financial literacy today, that financial literacy might have actually meant something different in the 70s to folks who were trying to find ways of battling against segregation in very explicit terms?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting to think about the sort of contemporary conversations about financial literacy, because that's actually how I first kind of stumbled upon this project. If you'll let me talk about that for a second. But I worked at this at a poverty law center in Chicago, the Sargent Shriver National Center for Poverty Law, between undergrad and grad school, and I did marketing and development for them. And one thing that was really interesting, right, they were this law center that did litigation and advocacy on behalf of poor people, and I was trying to help them raise money to fund that work. And it was very easy to get funding for things like children's savings accounts, asset-based development, right, financial literacy programs. And it was in part because banks had this mandate from the Community Reinvestment Act that I mentioned already, that they had to do something, right? And so by the time I was working there in 2005, 2006, instead of, figuring out how to necessarily bring new resources to resident-led redevelopment and, previously or continued to be redlined neighborhoods, instead they were doing things like making donations to the nonprofit that I worked at. And it was harder to fund, our work around, housing or public housing, domestic violence, but the asset-based development stuff was like, you could find some money for that. So I knew about this law from my job at the nonprofit. And I thought when I started digging into this project, I was originally just interested in the history of the Community Reinvestment Act. And I thought for sure what I was going to be writing about was like how banks became important to anti-poverty programs, right? That's like, yes. But instead I found the social movement that was a lot more complicated and really exciting. But so as to the question of what we can learn about financial literacy, I think you're absolutely right to talk about, I think you used the language that it wasn't necessarily financial literacy, but learning about the financial system, right? The concept of financial literacy was definitely not front and center to these activists in the 1970s. And I think to their credit, right, they didn't think that if poor people just figured out how to manage their money, right, or if poor people could just figure out how to put a little extra aside all the time, that would solve their problems, right? Poor people are poor because they don't have money, not because they don't know where the bank is or something, right? So instead, what they were interested in learning about was how the financial system worked, right? That they were interested in what kinds of rules and regulations are already in place that can help us achieve some of the goals that we're interested in. And those were, right, getting local institutions, right, the sort of George Bailey, It's a Wonderful Life kind of savings and loans that now are, kind of out of style. But in the period that we're talking about, right, as they were organizing in the 70s, like those were the kinds of institutions that most white Americans especially banked with on the regular, right? These were sort of, you go in there to cash your paycheck and you'd go in there to make your payment on your mortgage, right? There's a lot of sort of interaction between people and these financial institutions. And so they had questions about what rules and regulations are already in place that can help us hold those institutions accountable to the community outside their offices. And then what new policies, what new strategies would we have to put in place in order to get those institutions to behave like the social institutions we expect them to be, right? So the context of the 70s, I use the term the financial common sense, right, in the book, the idea that because of New Deal regulations, right, that forced savings and loans to be pretty boring institutions, right? They were locally oriented. They focused on making loans and collecting passbook, right, deposits in passbook accounts. This was not, it's really sort of exciting and dynamic and racy banking. It was rather sort of routine business. And so New Deal regulations that said, you have to keep I think it was 80% of your mortgages inside of this 50-mile radius, right, that there were limits on how much interest they could pay, right? New Deal regulations created a sort of policy regime that made these institutions locally oriented and kind of boring, right? And so for folks sort of operating on that financial common sense, that they wanted to hold those institutions accountable to behave like the service kind of oriented financial institutions they expected them to be. Because from the perspective of a lot of these folks, right, especially white people in these neighborhoods, they'd had these relationships with these banks for young adults, maybe a new relationship, but they'd seen their parents have this kind of relationship with financial institutions. And it seemed like very fishy timing that as these neighborhoods became what they called transitional urban neighborhoods, right, as Black and other sort of Black and brown neighbors started moving into their communities, was when those banks stopped behaving the way they expected them to, right? And so that seemed to them to be the sort of explanation for what had happened, right? That those banks started to treat their neighborhoods the way they had long treated Black and brown neighborhoods.
Right, right. And your book does an incredible job populating our general narrative about this period in really new and interesting ways, right? So most people, when they're thinking about the story of the 60s to the 70s, it's not necessarily about this move from kind of localized banking to something that's much more sleek and full of mortgage-backed securities kind of moving at the speed of light, right? But you have that as a really important narrative thread through the work. You also, in some ways give us a way of thinking about the 1970s as a very different kind of moment, even in terms of the racial politics. And I don't want to miss the point about thrifts and the banking. We'll definitely get there, but I want to start the way you start your work, which is, with this chapter that you're entitling Beyond Backlash, right? That you're very committed to, making sure that people acknowledge and tip the hat to how we understand a certain kind of white intransigence to things like busing. There's obviously a really robust literature about mass incarceration. There's all kinds of stuff about the rise of the right and conservatism. But your folks in your study are slightly different than that narrative. Tell us a little bit about the folks that you locate in the neighborhood of Austin in Chicago and how that gives us a different way of understanding racial politics in the 70s.
Definitely. So these were folks who were trained these are Alinsky organizers, right? And
Alinsky, right? Yeah, very right, important labor organizer, right? Yeah.
Right, and so they're Alinsky-inspired organizers, right? So they're taking this sort of what they think of as kind of like a pragmatic approach to organizing the neighborhood that's supposed to be about recognizing one's self-interest and the way that a community organization can help advance people's self-interest. So there's some interesting stuff, sort of reading through the sources to see how they sort of talk through this issue of relying on self-interest, because there is an instance in which one of the organizers is sort of telling another one that they might hear that the context is that these two folks in this part of the narrative are both, I would call it sort of anti-racist in our contemporary parlance, but they're talking about how when they go organize white people in Austin, it's possible that they're going to hear things that they don't agree with, right?
Right.
The assumption being like some people might have racist things to say, but the strategy is to talk about how there's a common interest among Austinites to keep Austin a good place to live, right? What does that look like? There are contested meanings to what a good place to live looks like, but focusing on that, the schools will not be overcrowded, or right, that you're not going to see panic selling, right, where all the white people sort of agree at once that they're all going to try to move out of the neighborhood, and then what is property values, right? Property values will decline, and so right, they're trying to sort of emphasize self-interest. And so what's interesting about that is it leaves space for some folks who are sort of committed to anti-racism and social justice to sort of be a part of that, right? There's an instance where there's like a white woman who moves from the suburbs into Austin because she was trying to figure out how to sort of be in solidarity with the Black freedom struggle. And she heard that would be a way to do it, to move into Austin. You also have space for other people who really like living in a city and don't want to move away, right? Like the leader of, or one of the leaders of this organization, for example, was a person who really liked living in cities, this woman, Gail Sankata, right? That she, just the particularities of living in a 2-flat house in Chicago where her parents also lived, right? And the other, right, it's like her nuclear family and one flat and then her parents on the other. It's really hard to find a house like that if you piece out to the suburbs, right?
Right. She didn't own a car either, right? Was it that also a part of it? She didn't actually own a vehicle? So
she didn't drive a car, and she liked going to bingo that she could walk to, right? So there are things about sort of urban living that some people also find really appealing. And then the other thing about applying to self-interest, like among these sort of white people at a moment of integration, is that the white people who are like, I'm not interested in that, they don't show up, right? So what you end up having is a sort of self-selected group of white people, along with the organizers worked really hard to organize in the parts of the neighborhood that were turning over to a predominantly Black population and quickly, right? Recognizing that those places didn't already have for example, right, parishes where they might be able to organize, or other sort of existing community institutions. And so they worked really hard to build block clubs and create sort of like street level organizations, and be very explicit that they were interested in having an interracial organization, right? So they sent, the way the organizers talked about it was they sent their sort of most committed and most sort of energized organized to the majority Black section of Austin to really try to hit the streets in those sections. So, right, you end up, it's definitely not a story in which, right, all white people in Austin, right, have sort of seen the light and nobody moves away, right? That's not what happens. But what you do have is then a group of people who are committed to sort of navigating this sort of racial transition, especially because they've seen the way that it has happened in neighboring neighborhoods, right, nearby neighborhoods, and they don't want a sort of resegregated Austin that's predominantly Black, where the schools are overcrowded, right? They all want to sort of imagine a different possibility there, right, of an integrated neighborhood where folks can work together to not let real estate speculators, especially determine the fate of the neighborhood.
Right. So this is, in part, one of the many reasons why it's critical, but also deeply challenging to do local and national work, right? I mean, again, not to oversell the point, but it's really critical to highlight the fact that so much of what you're describing as these nuances between religious and the secular, between the folks who are, working class white, middle class white, and Black, like, you can't get that kind of granularity if you're simply looking at these questions from 3,000 feet up, or general surveys of urban history, or just going to the National Archives. And so I just want to, number one, like, applaud your ability to balance these really deep kind of local studies. And you look at our archives folks, and it's like, this really clear footprint of organizational, painstaking field work, basically, to pull all this stuff together. So it really is incredible. But one of the things that oftentimes then happens when you have the right kind of local study that casts back up to the national in the way that you do, is things like state repression as a kind of national talking point then take on an entirely different look. I mean, you actually highlight the fact that this small group of, residential, almost community control activists organizing for a better Austin, they get infiltrated by, like, the Daily Machine's Red Squad, like, trying to take over and collapse an organization that they somehow consider to be a threat to machine politics at this time.
That's true. That's true. Yeah, and thank you for reading it that way. I really appreciate the. But I guess I would say, to the credit of the historical actors that I studied, it was their organizing that went from the local level to realizing that the problems that they had, they were national problems. Right. At first, it was problems sort of created by the predatory FHA programs that King Taylor writes about, right, that first sort of brought their attention to the fact that we're seeing all this panic selling, we're seeing this blockbusting, we're seeing hundreds of real estate speculators flocking onto one particular neighborhood, and as they're trying to figure out why is this happening, and sort of but they're always asking sort of who has the power, and trying to follow the money and that sort of thing, and they realize it's really the FHA programs that create the infrastructure for this kind of exploitative panic selling to happen. Mm-hmm. And so recognizing that it's federal policies that are creating this infrastructure pushes them to look for federal solutions, right, and organize with folks in other transitional neighborhoods around the country who they imagine must be having the same problems, and then it turns out that they are.
Right. And for those folks who have a little bit of local pride, you should know that it is Baltimore, Maryland, where this tiny group from Chicago scales up to the national level. Rebecca describes a conference of 1972, where this organizing for a better Austin group comes to Baltimore, and through their proximity to DC, realize that there's a possibility here to really create a national organization. Tell us a little bit about that move in the context of really scaling up these questions of financial freedom, economic self-determination, neighborhood rights, and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Well, this was definitely an instance in which as a historian, my appreciation for contingency was like really, elevated. But because originally, so they had this first meeting in Chicago in March of 1972, and a lot of people showed up, right? They had to have like overflow TVs to show people in, the auditorium what was happening from a different room. And so after it was over, they were just sort of like, well, what do we do next? We haven't really built a national organization before. It's like, I guess we have another meeting, and they do it in Baltimore, right? And as they're there, right, they decide that what they're going to create is this sort of national federation, right? A way for neighborhood groups to kind of communicate with each other and stay sort of, connected, to talk about best practices, to coordinate strategies and tactics that where national solutions are in order, they're going to need to apply national pressure. So it's important to be able to demonstrate that, right, to national policymakers that they have clout across the country. But then they're still going to sort of maintain these local community organizations that are really focused on local issues, right? Again, in the sort of Alinsky theory that it's local issues that will get people to leave their couches and show up for a meeting, right? When you're talking about something that has like concrete, outcomes that really matter for where you live. But they also, right, while they're in Baltimore, just realize that the proximity to Washington, D.C., there's also this sort of realization that when they can come together in a place like Baltimore, and eventually it'll be D.C., and show their strength in numbers to national policymakers, that they want to organize direct actions and protest, what they'll call hits, to show folks like, Romney as a secretary of HUD, or other folks who are not household names to us, right? So a lot of these like assistant secretaries of HUD and things like that. It's like these activists like know who those people are in a way that I think a lot of Americans at the time would not have considered these folks household names. But they'll show up at their offices, or or show up at a protest in their backyards and disrupt somebody's daughter's wedding if they need to try to get these sit-down meetings. Another sort of example of just contingency is then trying to figure out how to support and sustain this work. They have to deal with the question of like, how do you incorporate an organization like that? How do we make it official? And so there's this interesting moment when they have to create both like a 501c3 and a 501c4, because one of them can lobby and the other one can raise money. And one of the organizers, an activist named Helen Murray, talked about how it was like we didn't really care like what we had to call ourselves. We were just out there to shake the trees. So a really sort of just a sort of, I don't know, it was a really they were learning as they were going, right, and sort of inventing the playbook as new problems and new opportunities sort of presented themselves.
Right. And the chapter that opens in Baltimore of the National People's Action, they do some pretty interesting things. I mean, not to go too deep, but just give us an example of the kind of local moves that these chapters tend to make.
Mm-hmm. The local moves in Baltimore?
Baltimore, yeah, just one example, quickly.
So for the Baltimore folks.
Yeah. Fan service, right, fan service.
So I'll say one of the affiliates in Baltimore had a really interesting sort of anti-redlining strategy that sort of comes out a little bit later in the book. And it was a program called Dedicated Dollars, right? It was a campaign in which they were trying to organize folks in Baltimore to decide sort of which, that if they took their money to this one, I think it might have been Baltimore Savings and Loan, right? If they took their savings money, their sort of deposits to this one particular financial institution, that they would also bring these pledge forms where they could kind of indicate like where they wanted their dollars to go, right? Where they wanted that savings and loan to invest their dollars. And so a strategy like that, right, it was supposed to also show the financial institution that these folks were organized, right? And if they were organized enough to say, we want our loans to go to these particular places, they might also be organized enough to pull their money out of that institution and take it somewhere else. So that was a Baltimore specific story that came out of the archive.
And again, making good on this vision that, was affirmed in popular culture by the George Bailey, It's a Wonderful Life approach, right? That somehow where I bank is supposed to be connected and accountable to this broader community. Again, this is one of those really fine-grained points that is really worth kind of having a megaphone about and broadcasting, which is, the work that you're doing on thrifts and another word for savings and loans, and thinking about these small banks and almost in a way helping to underscore that these financial outfits, be they small or medium sized, that they have a jurisdiction, and that jurisdiction then becomes a place where discrimination can happen, right? So again, it's easy to look at a map with the colors of the grades from the the homeowners loan corporation and say, oh, here's redlining, and then kind of keep it moving. But what you're actually pointing to is the fact that these small banks, and again, these savings and loans, are really instrumental in creating the redlining problem on a grand scale, right? That it really comes down to relationships, local knowledge, and as you're kind of taking this bite out of the age of deregulation, part of what you're talking about is really trying to change what regulation is actually doing, how we think about it. And so I would love, in some ways it's a two-part question. One, what would you say, or how would you say we can reappreciate the importance of these locally grounded financial outfits on the first score? And then secondly, what does this possibly open the door to in terms of rethinking how we imagine regulation to be related to inequality?
Mm-hmm. Well, I hope this answers the first question, but what's coming to mind, right, is that it's important to understand too that while thrifts were so important in actually doing the redlining, right, it's also the case that right as they might be held accountable by activists who are paying attention to this, right, and who are at the federal level with the ear of the Senate Banking Committee, right? This HMDA legislation from 1975 is reportedly created by organizers at an organizer meeting. They're writing on giant papers at the floor and then take it to the Senate Banking Committee. It gets chopped up, and right. So they have there's the sense that the regulators are really paying attention to the activists who are mad about redlining. So there's this opportunity where maybe these local institutions are going to be held to account. But what I try to show in the book is that the ground is really shifting below these financial institutions right at the moment that activists finally get some traction, right? Because the 70s, back to this 70s question, this is also, the 70s is a terrible time to be a thrift, right? It's a terrible time to try to run a savings and loan institution, right? This is an era of high interest rates. And if you think about what that means for a savings and loan, right, if you make a bunch of loans in the 1960s and the people are paying back their mortgages with really low interest rates, right, and then later on down the road, interest rates are higher, and then people are expecting higher interest on their savings accounts, right? You're taking in a tiny bit of interest, but you're supposed to pay it out higher. You also have folks, right, these sort of free market enthusiasts, some of them sort of coming out of the Nixon administration with this Hunt Commission report in the early 1970s. And they're starting to make this argument that what's wrong in the financial institution right now is that we have regulations that are built for the 1930s, but now we're in the 1970s. Times have changed. It's time to rethink what we're doing here. And they argue that when thrifts are experiencing problems that are created by this gesture that I just made, right, the way to solve the problem is to let them behave more like other kinds of banks, right? To let them break out of this trap of only lending on mortgages and taking these passbook accounts, and instead start to experiment in new kinds of investments and new kinds of lending, and in new kinds of savings accounts that will pay people higher interest. And so, right, this question about these local institutions, what's happening to them is even if you have, I think some of these folks too in the savings and loans were sympathetic to reinvestment activists, right? As much as a lot of them were not. Right, you still did have some folks who were interested in this idea of community lending and saw, banking as a kind of service, and some of them who were willing to meet with activists. Again, it's not a huge crew, but right, some of them were responsive. But even if a savings and loan executive wanted to participate in some of these efforts and start to make more loans in communities like these, they were facing all of these other challenges about just the structure of their business model in the 1970s. So so right there's already sort of the contingencies of the moment, right? The context of the 1970s and what it meant to be a thrift meant that already, right, they're sort of set up to fail if one of the things they wanted to do is actually help some of these reinvestment activists. Did I answer that first
Yeah,
question?
yeah, no, absolutely, and you actually answered the second one as well, right? Because I mean, you're basically pointing to the fact that you've got, on the one hand, and you mentioned this in one of your earlier answers, like in some cases, individual thrifts are going to look at the customers coming in a desegregating neighborhood and say, you know what, thanks but no thanks, and decide that they're not going to behave as a good old-fashioned small-town bank should behave. So there's that. But then again, part of what you do to round out the equation is also talk about these moments of structural adjustment where somebody like George Romney, operating as an extension of Richard Nixon, says, well, the way we're going to get more capital to invest in this market is by raising interest rates.
Yeah.
And in some ways, it's violating things like, Regulation Q, which again, for those who are in the field, and you talk about this actually really smoothly in your work, to say, look, there's a certain way in which interest rates are being capped to allow people to participate in the small town banking. And now you've got the Department of Housing and Urban Development basically offering these kind of, sweetheart interest rates that are undermining small town banking, right? I mean, again, and just showing that complexity, even as the racism continues to pace, in a somewhat personal way. That to me is one of the really most extraordinary. Now I'm doing your gesture now, the up and down, right? Because it is a question of kind of levers and pulleys. But it's exactly right that the regulations and the racism become mutually reinforcing, and it becomes for your activists to respond. Yeah.
And to add to that point too, I mean, we can also think about that at the same time, there are also, right, this is also, the 70s is also an era of increased, right, suburban developments too.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And a lot of those suburban developments are within the 50-mile radius of some of these savings and loans. So to the point of like things are hard for the savings and loans, but then we can also think about what's going on with the suburbs in the 1970s. And are all those developments losing access to mortgages at this time? No, right? That they're still, so the point for reinvestment activists is like, well, if times are hard, right, if credit's tight, you're still making some loans, but they're not to our neighborhoods, right? Those loans are going to new suburban developments. And there's also, an interesting way, again, where like what's going on in the banking industry comes full circle there too, because what I learned through the research as well was like what I hadn't really thought about this before, but just like what it means to be a banker and thinking about how you're going to make your next batch of loans. Do you want to sit down with like one neighbor at a time in Austin to talk about their roof that needs a home improvement loan, and then like their front porch that needs a home improvement loan? Or do you want to sit down with this developer, right, who is going to have like 70 mortgages that are all going to be coming through soon once that development goes up? And it's like, oh, that is a much easier way to make loans, right? To say, let's package, right, let's get in on this deal with that's going to come along with 70 mortgages instead of some home improvement loans.
Right.
So.
And you give a really important look too at even when the FHA, decides to move into this position with, new mortgage programs and, in some ways trying to target certain communities that have been historically redlined, or that this in some ways then ends up contributing to these narratives of government corruption, government failure, right? HUD becomes embroiled in these lawsuits. I mean, there's a way in which, again, as you talk through the private sector's own benefits, there are ways in which even HUD is leaning into the private sector in ways that are really causing there to be, extraordinary forms of predation and other things that are still going to cause really intimate problems and small scale problems, household by household, for working class people. So but before I make a different move, I just want to kind of rest on this point about the FHA, because we know the FHA story in the 30s, but you're also adding to our knowledge about how the FHA gets implicated in these newer forms of predatory housing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and have definitely learned a lot from Kianga Taylor in that regard too. So how many times am I going to say her name during this?
We get a 3-time mention. I got 2 more to go before we get out of here. So.
Yeah, but it was just really interesting. But again, I mean, I found it in the sources before, like I got the opportunity to read Kianga's excellent dissertation and then book, but just to see the folks in the reinvestment movement talking about how their neighborhood had been FHA'd, right, as a verb, right, like as a thing that happened to them. The recognition that, right, what happened when these kinds of programs came into came into these communities, right, is that folks would talk about how it would turn them into ghost towns, right, that there would be these homes that were often not in good enough shape for people to live in, and then the realtors, or I should say real estate men or real estate women, these are not official realtors, would often have excuses why the home buyer couldn't enter the house to see what was going on inside. But that agent would say, you know, it's FHA approved, which for some buyers, that sounds like the federal government must have had some hand in certifying this, and they made sure it was okay, right? And so, you know, folks would end up with a mortgage on a house that was about to fall apart, and then they'd be responsible for paying, for paying whatever it costs to bring it up to code. And then a lot of times that would mean that they walked away from the mortgage, there'd be a foreclosure, right? And then there, you know, the process would just happen again, right? Sometimes on the same houses over and over, that same kind of process, just extracting, right, the, you know, fees on commission, the sort of closing costs, getting the FHA payout once the mortgage was foreclosed on. So yeah, it was really, really damaging stuff. And so then for these reinvestment activists, they looked at the FHA programs and they said, we want conventional mortgages in our neighborhoods, not FHA, right? So meaning they wanted mortgages where that local bank would keep the loan on their, right, on their books, right, and have some sort of interest in having a home buyer who could pay it back, as opposed to an FHA loan, which would be bundled with other FHA loans and then sold off to investors. So the idea of having a conventional loan where there'd still be some relationship between the entity that held the loan and the homeowner was really important to them. And they also said, can't we fix this FHA program? Because for some folks, this is actually the only way, right? The sort of affordable low down payment loans could help people if they were reformed to not be exploitative. Right.
Right. And this is one of those things very much like the public housing story as well, where, you know, programs that emerged in the 1930s with these really, you know, kind of clear and strict guidelines, they're enforced in ways that really do help working class people have, you know, a modest and, you know, upwardly mobile lifestyle. But then as these projects get racialized, the enforcement of really important regulations just goes to the wayside, right? So, I mean, you couldn't get FHA funding if you didn't meet really strict building requirements through the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And in fact, in my own work on Miami, you know, it became clear that the landlords who wanted FHA support for rental developments were trying constantly to compromise the enforcement of building standards under the FHA rules, and FHA officials wouldn't do it. But then, as you point out, as you start to do these, you know, reinvestment, you know, programs, and oh yeah, we're going to give it to these riskier buyers. So if it's a riskier mortgage, we'll just kick up the interest rate for you on the back end, but not really allow the housing enforcement and the code enforcement on the front end, or force that onto the person who's going to occupy it and then have to pay it out of their own pocket. And so it's an extraordinary example of it. The problem isn't government in the abstract. The problem is how regulations are robustly or less robustly enforced depending on the perceived kind of social status of the folks taking advantage of those programs. Want to make one last wonky pivot, just because I've got you here as a captive guest, and so I have to ask you this, because you make a point in your book to draw the distinction between fiscal policy and monetary policy. And some of our attendees might not be aware of the difference, but, you know, just to give a very quick example of, you know, when people, you know, tell these Jeremiads about highways kind of plowing through center cities, right? That's an example of a program that's basically taxing and spending. It's a kind of fiscal policy that's applied on the urban landscape. Again, too, with the FHA, you know, this is a program about mortgage insurance, but it really is about using government dollars to try to underwrite something. So that's a government expenditure. Give us, you know, in your kind of quickest summation, how is monetary policy different, and why does monetary policy matter for telling the story of urban equality?
Well, so monetary policy instead, right, we're sort of talking about the state's ability to create money, I would say, right, and also to sort of set interest rates that shape how people can obtain loans, right? And so how people can get money, right? We're talking about money stuff instead of government funding, the creation of money. And so Yeah, when I started out on this project, I was not interested in monetary policy. And I think I maybe cursed out loud when I realized from the sources that I was going to have to learn anything about monetary policy. But it came from the sources, right? That so I'll try to be brief, but there's a moment in the late 1970s where at that point, the activists that I study had already won some gains through the Community Reinvestment Act, through that Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, and they had an opportunity to start to try to implement some community bank partnerships, right, that could help neighborhood-led revitalization. But in the late 1970s, sometimes you had interest rates as high as 15%, right, on a mortgage. So for these folks, right, they're looking at what they've won, the ability to, sort of get partnerships with banks, and saying, well, what good is this if nobody in our neighborhood can afford 15% on a mortgage?
Right.
So they started to ask questions about monetary policy, right? They started to ask questions about who sets interest rates? Like, where does this come from? Why are they so high? Who is this helping? Because it's not helping us, right? And so, so that's sort of how I've made my way into caring about interest rates and the Federal Reserve, right? Basically following the sources. And the reason it mattered for urban history is because the Federal Reserve, right, the sort of monetary policy pursued by the Federal Reserve under Paul Volcker in the late 70s and the early 80s, it created new obstacles for these activists who are trying to revitalize their own neighborhoods on their own terms without being displaced, without gentrification, right, to have this sort of high cost of lending, high price attached to lending. And so there's just really interesting stuff, like they start to target the Federal Reserve, right, that they protest Paul Volcker. They end up with some sit-down meetings and some, listening sessions. But ultimately, what I show in the book is that it is very hard for ordinary people to get the Federal Reserve to do something, right? That there's this sort of
Right.
assumption through the 20th century that what the Federal Reserve does is some technocratic stuff that happens in back rooms that, you have no business paying attention to unless you have some kind of advanced degree in economics. And I think that for historians, it's a really interesting departure. If you think about like the late 19th century, when all kinds of people were talking about the relationship between money and democracy, right? Thinking about the populace. And right, if you teach the intro to US history and you have to talk about the populace, you have to tell a bunch of, students why silver matters, right? So just a really big difference. But so, right, these folks become interested in monetary policy. They start to learn about it, and they teach folks about it in their network, right? That there's in their newsletter, they're explaining how these things work. They're organizing protests against Paul Volcker. And I think that one of the things that was really interesting for, just as an urban historian, was seeing the ways that some of their I make this argument that you start to see these like class interests that they articulate vis-a-vis sort of macroeconomics when they start to engage with monetary policy, right? They're talking not about what's, about workers and management or workers and capital, right? They're not sort of talking about like the workplace as the place where they're, sort of making sense of their class interests, but they're talking about what it's like to be a lower moderate income person, right? Or they're talking about what it's like to be someone who needs some borrowing in order to sort of make it through, right, their economic lives. They start to talk about the Federal Reserve doing redlining by class. They start to talk about the Federal Reserve as an entity that is guilty of economic discrimination. Right, and as I will shout out David Stein every time I have an opportunity to talk to people, but as the historian David Stein has been bringing our attention to, and when his book comes out and just changes the world, right, that it's also this reminder that the Federal Reserve is supposed to care about full employment too, right? They're not just supposed to care about interest rates and inflation. And so, the activists become sort of aware of that as they want to learn more about where interest rates come from. And so, yeah, the kicker for me was really seeing the obstacles that monetary policy created for people who are trying to sort of improve their lives on their own terms. And, eventually these activists also start to be really frustrated about the lack of access to good jobs in some of these neighborhoods too by the late 70s and the 80s. And they're interested in the way that the monetary policy of Paul Volcker is right, is sort of keeping a recession going sort of at the expense of low and moderate income people.
Right, right. I mean, and again, just to appreciate the difference that this makes in how people tend to narrate what happened in American cities. I mean, for, you know, most people coming through the discipline of urban studies, you kind of develop a relationship and a parable about someone like Robert Moses. Like he comes to occupy the front of your mind, and he's like the big villain of the mid 20th century. And now you're bringing characters like Paul Volcker into our much more, you know, front of mind understanding of how inequality gets replicated and perpetuates on well past the legislation of the 60s. I want to actually end, before we pivot to the Q&A from the audience, on this question of memory. You opened with it in discussion about your parents and your own arrival at some of these questions. And, you know, thinking about, you know, kind of where the civic conversation is now around housing and popular memory. You know, you can pretty safely read articles now in the New York Times and Time Magazine that will presume a knowledge of redlining. You can, you know, hear it being mentioned and shouted from, you know, politicians and, you know, very open kinds of conversations. And when we talk about like the wealth gap and so forth, redlining is always a character there. And so for, you know, you as somebody who has now taken a considerable amount of time and attention to show us all these other ways and institutions and characters and complexities about what continues well after redlining, what do you think is to be, one, kind of gained, and what areas do we need to continue to press to help us add your story to our dominant civic memory, right? Is there a challenge that is before you now as an author and as a commenter to get people to understand your story now that they've taken up redlining and accept redlining? Oh yeah, redline, absolutely, FHA, HOAC, sure. I got that now. That tells us what happens, you know, in the present day. And you're like, no, wait, right? What's the work that has to be done? And why is it important to kind of give us those intervening decades about what happened? And how hard will it be, do you think, to get people to really see that in a somewhat easy way as part of their civic memory?
Oh my goodness. So, I mean, I guess I think one of the ripple effects of how you can pick up the New York Times and read about redlining or something might be that it means we may have more folks who are open to the idea that these entities, these institutions, and the human beings who make up something like financial markets or housing markets, or right, who make mortgages, that these might not be neutral institutions or actors, right? That it's possible that these institutions and actors have their own biases, right? Have their own sort of ideas about what's risky and what's valuable. And I think if folks sort of can understand that about the redlining story, right, they might be more open to thinking about right, other instances in which you know, housing, different forms of housing policies can also perpetuate inequalities, right? And sort of thinking about like, how do I make this story part of you know, how can I get people to know this as well as they know redlining? I guess something that's like coming to mind is maybe we could all like ask questions about why it is that, you know, like Chase, Manhattan Bank, and Wells Fargo and all these institutions, like they still have these like community lending units, or right, these like neighborhood programs. They have this like corporate responsibility arm, while we know they're doing all of this other stuff that undermines what this tiny little division is doing. And I think that people see those, right? Like a lot of times if you walk into your bank, which I don't know when's the last time anybody did that, but they put their posters up that are sort of like celebrating their, you know, asset-based development, or there's, you know, college savings accounts that they're doing with local youth and that kind of thing. But I think that if we try to historicize those, because that's weird, right? It's weird that those two things are happening at the same time. And I think the historical answer to why you see those, you know, lending divisions is this story, right? That there's a new sort of regulatory framework in the 70s that says like community reinvestment is important. Banks had been redlining, you got to stop it. And then instead of actually getting some kind of reparations for that harm, what we end up with instead is, neighborhood lending units and banks that are a lot more interested in maximizing profits and, seeking out lucrative investments.
Okay. So I want to turn to some of the questions we're getting from the audience, and just to reiterate to those folks who may have joined us a little bit later, before Stuart's opening remarks, to please use the Q&A feature. If you have a burning question, we'll be able to toss it to Professor Marchiel as we move forward in our conversation. And so by all means, continue to formulate that as we move forward here. So I have a question that's coming about, again, the case study part of your project, thinking about Austin. This is coming from Beth Harbor, who wants to know, did Austin have an equity assurance program like Oak Park and Lawndale to diffuse panic selling? So you spend some time talking about panic selling and panic peddlers in the work. And so is there an equity assurance program that's there to try to push back against some of that stuff?
I remember reading about those equity assurance programs, and the place that comes to mind is Oak Park. I didn't see any record of an equity assurance program in Austin.
Mm-hmm.
No.
And
isn't that an 80s program? Am I wrong about that?
I'm not sure.
Not to Google during this. But I didn't see any. No, I didn't see anything like that in my research.
Mm-hmm. And just to round out the question for those who may not have a chance to read the book yet, it is 2020. As far as I'm concerned, the best thing about 2020 is that this book has come out. You can associate that with a good year. Beth says it's the 1970s in terms of the assurance program.
And I wonder if that too is because Austin being sort of a neighborhood within Chicago rather than its own kind of municipal. Having its own municipal government sort of oversee a program like that. But I did not see that strategy, at least in the research that I did. So I guess that's leaving open the possibility that it was somewhere and I didn't see it, but.
Okay, all right, I'm gonna move forward, but again, there's a really important detailed discussion of panic peddling as something that is trying to be regulated against on the books, but how it's being enforced is somewhat uneven, and it's absolutely part of the story.
Well, I'll add too, they did take some really interesting, Nathan is inviting me to talk about what they did do. But so, the folks in Austin did take some interesting tactics to try to stop panic peddling that weren't necessarily the sort of equity program. But one of them, for example, was opening up their own kind of real estate office in Austin, where they tried to do kind of reverse racial steering, right? And the activists themselves talked about how they had to walk a really fine line because there were neighborhoods in Austin, right? There were sections of Austin that were becoming predominantly Black quite quickly, and others that were staying white and didn't seem right. They talked about sort of block by block change. So some of the white neighborhoods or white blocks seemed rather far off, relatively speaking. And so the real estate group that they organized would move if a Black home buyer was interested in buying a house through them or renting also, they help with rentals too. They would try to place a Black resident in that white section, right? And if a white person came in, they tried to put the white person in the section of Austin that was becoming, right, that was sort of racially transitioning, that was being overserved by panic peddlers, right? And so very tricky, right, to sort of say, we're against all of this exploitative, race-conscious, racist panic selling, but at the same time, we're going to help people. We're only going to serve certain people in certain neighborhoods. So that was a tricky one. And then they would also do things like, for example, invite a panic seller over to a house that they said someone was interested in selling, and then get him down into the basement and then block off the stairs so he couldn't get back up the stairs until he agreed that he would not sell, right, that he would get out of Austin, basically. So there was a combination of trying to use their own power to shape the housing market, and also trying to use direct action, right, to get some of these panic sellers out of the neighborhood, because they are also supportive of their local real estate agents, right? There were some folks who had been working in Austin for a long time that they saw those people, those realtors, as a different group of people than the panic sellers who just showed up once there was this sort of racial transitioning happening.
Right, right. Yeah, and again, for folks who are interested in learning more about kind of grassroots agency and all these different tactics, I mean, there are these extraordinary examples of like recording racially steering realtors and publishing the transcripts in the newspaper.
3 pages of transcripts.
Right. Again, that scene where they're like surrounding, you know, a racially steering realtor in the basement, it almost sounded like, you know, the Good Witch version of lynching, right? This kind of mob action that's there to just like instill the fear of the neighborhood in folks. So yeah, there's all these different tactics that are really extraordinarily documented. Moving on to another question. This is from Ted Wasaki. We have, given your accurate assessment of the challenge to shape monetary policy and federal spending priorities during the 70s and 80s, what is your assessment of today's opportunity to promote modern monetary theory to combat the deficit myth, per Stephanie Kelton's recent book, for national reinvestment initiatives to advance local equitable development?
First of all, Ted Wasaki, hello, and thank you for being here. Ted is one of the people who was an NPA organizer and was gracious enough to let me interview him for the book. So hi, Ted. But so I think that's a great question. And something that comes to mind is, I mean, one thing I noticed sort of from the activist youth that I studied is that there was this effort, right, to sort of to educate folks who are in the movement about, right, some of these ideas. So if you want a local organization to be able to file a Community Reinvestment Act challenge and then be able to win a community bank partnership from that challenge, right, that means that folks around the country, folks in these in the local community organizations need information about which federal regulatory agency they need to file with and what those files need to look like and that sort of thing. So just the sort of education that came along with this activism sort of comes to mind as the a first answer there, right? Like we need to all work together to sort of, you know, educate ourselves and educate our people in our networks about the myths around the deficit, right? We need to talk more about the idea that taxing and spending is not literally like taking somebody's, you know, tax money and then like walking it over and spending it somewhere else, right? The idea that the state is its own issuer of currency, right? These kinds of ideas I think need to become part of our new common sense. And I mean, I hope that I know that there are sort of people working on this already, but I'm hoping that we can make more traction there and faster, because combating the sort of bipartisan obsession with deficit spending that we've seen over the last, you know, 20, 30 years, I think it's going to be a difficult one, but.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's actually a proto transition, because we've answered the questions in the queue. And again, as the spirit moves you to, please do feel compelled to drop a question in the Q&A and we'll get to it. But I can exercise chair's prerogative now. And actually, you know, in the minutes that we have left, we got about maybe, you know, 10, 15 minutes left. Just have you comment a little bit on this massive thing called the presidential election of 2020. It's kind of an event that has real relevance for all kinds of themes and topics that your work explores. And in the lead up to our conversation today, you know, I had floated if you had any take or you know, position or any thoughts at all about what we might imagine to be, you know, one kind of job one on this question of financial justice, you know, with a new presidential administration. And particularly, you know, there was news that Mehrsa Baradaran, a very well-known historian of Black banking, she wrote the book, The Color of Money, and did some earlier work on postal banking, that she was tapped to be part of Joe Biden's transition team and thinking about, you know, what could possibly come next from a Biden White House. So, you know, one, you know, what do you imagine being, you know, possible in this moment coming off of the election? And if you have any comment at all about what it means to even have somebody with Mehrsa's, you know, fluency to possibly be part of this moment. Again, banking scholars aware of race, you know, being pulled into the formal, like, you know, high level DC policy discussion, what that might possibly signal going forward.
I mean, I hope it's a good sign, right? I hope it's an encouraging sign. I guess one thing that I just found kind of surprising is, I guess if you would have asked me, 6 months ago or something, if I thought that part of the movement for Black lives in general, and then sort of organizing in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, would have sort of shifted the mood such that it might impact a Treasury transition team. Like, I'm not sure if I would have guessed that. So I think that in itself is kind of is surprising. And it's possible to imagine that Biden might have included someone like Broaderon in a transition team without this sort of movement in the streets over the last several months. But it does feel like a plausible conclusion to say that this movement created a moment for folks who center racial disparity and economic policy to be a part of this conversation, right? To be a part of the transition team. I think that, the obstacles will be, to sort of repeat what I just said, the bipartisan fear of deficits, right? And the sort of, I think the sort of lack of understanding on behalf of a lot of members of Congress about how money and how federal spending actually work, right? There's a sort of tendency to refer back to that like household budget analogy that doesn't actually hold up when you sort of think about the reality that states can create money. Thinking here again about Stephanie Kelton, like, I can't just make up money and then go spend it at the store. But if you have, someone like Broaderon in a transition, I mean, I think it's really exciting to think that somebody who, advocates so hard for postal banking to be in a position like this in the Treasury, right? And so if folks haven't seen or are not familiar with Marissa Broaderon's work, I'd really encourage to start with the TED Talk she did about postal banking, right? And where she talks about, she uses the sort of language of just how expensive it is to be poor, and talks specifically about, the way that financial fees, and, sort of really punitive fees that folks get for not having enough money in their checking account or in their savings account, right? That's sort of part of what it is to be poor in America today. And this idea that the post office, right, a trusted institution, one that has functioned as a bank in the past, one that has right outlets in communities around the country, right, that could become a sort of financial institution for everybody, right, and one that's not supposed to care about profit, right? The Postal Service is not supposed to care about profit, which would be really helpful to have in a banking institution, especially for low-income people. So I think it's really exciting that somebody who has devoted, so much of her work and her scholarship to understanding racial disparities in economic policy, is in this transition team. Now, whether or not, that means that Democrats and Republicans are going to let go of some of their worries about the deficit to, make some space for folks in the transition team to also say things like, no, that your grandchildren are not literally going to have to write a check to pay off the deficit in 50 years from now, right? That to me seems like a bigger obstacle, right? A harder obstacle to get over than the postal banking example. But
right. But I mean, very, very much to this question of, fighting these incremental, battles, or at least winning the kind of discursive war here is like, I never imagined that we would be having conversations in 2020 about sacking the post office as an institution, period. Right? Like that was literally on the table for discussion, as recently as a couple of months ago. And I have to imagine between the combination of the election, obviously there's going to be a transition, just the ways in which post offices proved so critical to the exercising of the franchise. And now, exactly to your point, I mean, Broaderon's work about post offices doing even more and in some ways behaving as the good old-fashioned thrifts maybe used to do in terms of neighborhood-based, providing safe banking, and those kinds of things. I mean, that feels like a promising way forward through an institution that tends to have a fair bit of trust already. Yeah.
And I do hope too that, I mean, if you start, talking about this issue by leading with like, do you think it's fair that banks can charge the kinds of fees that they do, right? It's like, I don't know, when you open a checking account or a savings account, you sign this, the fine print that's basically like, if you take your money out of an ATM that's not in network, we got you, right? If you have less than this amount in your account, we got you, right? It's like assume that they're going to nickel and dime you at every opportunity that comes up. And I think that there might be a bipartisan consensus around the idea that that's not good, right? That's not fair. And especially, if I do think that there's still kind of this lingering financial common sense from the New Deal, right? That people do, even if we are like in this era now where we kind of think about banks as giant corporations that operate for profit, right? At the same time, there is still this kind of the sense that they do some public service for us too, right? That they are, it's like, where else do you put your savings, right? Where they're still supposed to be stewards of our savings and our wealth at the same time. So I'm a little bit optimistic, maybe for not a great reason, but that some of this idea that banks ought to serve the common good might still be circulating somewhere, and maybe we can grab that in the years to come too.
There's a way in which this is pivoting off a question being asked by Bruce Barnhart, that you're telling a story that isn't necessarily one that's going to end in like the urban crisis, right? It's not about like the riots, and it's not about there being kind of blanket deterioration, but it's much more about these contingencies and pivots, and in many cases even possibilities. And in some ways, even starting from the point of rehabilitating what like the working class white ally can be, in the context of these economic populist movements. And so my question, coming from Bruce's inspiration, is there a way in which you're telling a story that has a lot more hope kind of baked into it than our narratives about decline that tend to define, how we think about the city and, the urban story more generally?
I think that the last sentence in the book is something about how the reinvestment movement offers some hope. So, yeah. But I mean, one thing that I do sort of take as hopeful from the story is just that, I mean, if you think about just the long haul that these organizations were, but they were really in it for the long haul, right? They started organizing this Austin group in 1966, and the first federal victory is in 1975. So just to think about what it means to stay sort of organized and activated and committed to pursuing that work, right? And then you have another 2 years until you get to the Community Reinvestment Act. And then throughout the 1980s, they're still, right, trying to make these community bank partnerships that come out of the CRA, they're trying to make them work, right? And they're still going back to Congress to say, expand the Community Reinvestment Act to include more kinds of financial institutions and add teeth to this legislation if that's all you're going to give us, right? And so I do think, right, they're so sort of focused on long-term goals, right? They're so and also focused on incremental wins to get there. And so I really do think that there is the story of their organizing, I did find to be hopeful. So, but the way that I talk about the outcome is really sort of roads partially taken and sort of missed opportunities as well, because I think it's important to say that they had a really capacious vision for what urban reinvestment would mean, right? When they talked about urban reinvestment, they meant, yeah, that banks should stop redlining and make more loans in their communities, but they also imagined a more robust role for the federal government that included federal spending, right? They also recognized that there were a lot of elderly people living in cities, and that they had particular housing needs, and that prescription drugs were already getting too expensive for them in the 70s and the 80s. And so included like prescription drugs for urban elderly as part of their vision for what it would mean to actually reinvest in these cities. So I mean, I guess I started by being this is like roads partially taken, but I think there's also something really, really useful in looking at their sort of ambition, right? Their ability to kind of dream big about what it would mean to, to repair some of these places that have been, redlined and disinvested in.
I have a question here. Oh, it was just removed, actually. It was from an attendee tuning in from South Africa, and he wanted to know how you might be thinking through, even bigger terms, the language of, say, uneven development, or like what finance kind of offers as a way of thinking through that. And so maybe as a parting shot, obviously, we've talked about the local and the national, and so many of these movements for economic justice are clearly going to be international, but, just off your own curiosity or interest in certainly, I'm sure, deep reading, what is the possible likelihood of there being an international movement around economic justice and, you know, rethinking our relationship to the financial sector? Clearly there's global, you know, capital flows that are making this harder to monitor all the time, but is it possible to build a kind of grassroots movement that can be, you know, in some ways chasing capital and holding it to account no matter where it might run around the world?
Oh man, that is a very big question. So I guess
Here we are, it's 4:30.
It's 4:30. So I mean, I guess the place I want to go with that one too is to think back about this particular organization that's National People's Action, and what comes to mind is that that organization is still around, right? That now they're called People's Action, right? And to this question about international solidarities, I think that among a lot of activists for racial justice and for economic justice today, including this network of People's Action, like they recognize the importance of solidarities that break the boundaries of the nation state. And I think a lot of them also recognize the ways in which the nation state is a sort of problematic unit, right, for defining, for sort of defining, for structuring our goals, right, or for dreaming, right, that the nation state is not necessarily the most useful unit for organizing some of these visions for the future. And I think that's true of People's Action too, right? They recognize that there are, right, folks who are not within the United States who are affected by American policies that they're worried about, right? That they are organizing around immigration too, and sort of recognizing the solidarities there that transcend nation states. So I think if there is going to be some kind of global movement, it's definitely going to come from, right, folks reimagining who they're sort of in solidarity with. And I think a lot of that is happening. The logistics though, and now I'm thinking too about like how building this network, right, there's like the case from the 70s is like somebody like went up to O'Hare Airport to find like phone books and look up whose names included, you know, community or housing, like in the organizational titles, right? And so in terms of the like logistics of how you actually build networks like that, like that'll be interesting to see the, you know, sort of potentials that new technology offer for those kinds of things too. Maybe it's more possible than it would have been a few generations ago.
I mean, this really is the question for quarantine, right? I mean, we're all thinking about logistics now. We're all building these networks, you know, absent the actual geography holding us together. And so this may well be, you know, the necessary, destined next step in a lot of these movements, for sure. Well, the book is called After Redlining, The Urban Reinvestment Movement in the Era of Financial Deregulation. Rebecca Marchiel, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your new work with us, and best of luck as you continue to get the word out.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. This was a really fun conversation. And thanks for all the questions too from the audience.
Thank you.